if he ran on this, uh, it didn't really quite, people didn't really understand the scope of what he was going to do.
Well, needless to say, it's been a busy and divisive few weeks, with supporters applauding Trump's swift follow-through and critics warning that his power is going unchecked. So today, we're going to be asking, is Donald Trump a danger to U.S. democracy? And joining me to discuss this are Greg Swenson, chair of Republicans Overseas and political commentator, in the studio with me. Greg, good afternoon. Good to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us on the line is Harold Meyerson, editor-at-large of the American Prospect and former Washington Post columnist. Harold, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
Harold, let's start with you. When asked the question, is Donald Trump a danger to U.S. democracy? What's your response?
Well, if you want to define U.S. democracy by what the founders intended and what the Constitution of the United States specifies, that's an easy yes, because it is up to Congress to establish, disestablish, appropriate funds, and withhold funds from departments and agencies of government. Plus which, I mean, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, which was fought in large part to deter the rule of the crown. And if you read the Declaration of Independence, it quite clearly specifies the grievances that Americans had were the arbitrary authority of King George to overturn legislation passed by the colonial legislatures. And, in many ways, the Constitution was written by people like James Madison to really make it impossible for a one-man autocrat, which the founders all feared very much, to assume power in the United States. And so they created co-equal legislative branches and judicial branches and set up a system of checks and balances under which every previous American president has largely, abided by those terms. Not so Donald Trump.
Okay, let's hear from Greg Swenson, chair of Republicans Overseas. What's your response to the question? I'm sure it's going to be that he isn't, but why not?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you look at two things. One is, he's not a threat to democracy. He is a threat to bureaucracy, that's for sure. And you can see that already with, with Doge and both the president and Elon Musk doing their best to reduce or dismantle, in some cases, like the education department, dismantle the unelected, unaccountable administrative state. And that's a way to restore trust with the voters. What's happening as the bureaucracy has become so bloated, presidents like President Biden ended up, using the administrative state to force regulations on businesses and on people that they couldn't get approved by Congress. So I agree with Harold. I think it should be the Congress. And so there's statutes on how USAID should distribute aid, and they're violating those statutes. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. So it takes the executive branch in many ways to execute on what Congress tells them to do.
But just
enforce the laws.
And just a quick question on that, just for the listeners to understand. I mean, Elon Musk has not been voted into power. He's not been approved by Congress, and yet he is the one who's going around shutting down USAID, the Department of Education. How are the checks and balances working to keep Elon Musk checked and balanced?
And I think you have the president to do that. So even though he is...
So doesn't that play into Harold's point that the president's got all the power right now?
Well, that's, in many cases, the presidents have a lot of power, and depending on what area we're talking about. But remember, he is unelected, but he's appointed by an elected official. And what's happened is these permanent administrative state employees that are not even appointed by the president. And now, look, you need civil servants. I get that. But there is too much of civil servants running the show. And then they get, in many ways, they're taken advantaged by presidents who come in and when they can't get things passed in Congress, they just use the administrative agencies, most of whom lean very left. So they're happy to cooperate with Democrat presidents, but not with Republicans.
Okay, Harold, a lot of people have been saying, and some people have been texting in, look, Donald Trump was really explicit in the run-up to the election of what he was going to do. He was going to free all the January 6th people that had found themselves in jail. He was going to bring in DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and slash what he thinks is government waste. And the people in the US use their democratic right to vote for President Trump and say, go ahead, we like what you're saying, off you go and do it. How can that possibly be considered undemocratic?
Well, two things. First of all, Trump said a lot of things while he was running, and it was not at all clear to some people around him that he was going to do these things. I will point out that shortly before Donald Trump pardoned all the January 6 rioters, his a significant person in the Republican hierarchy named J.D. Vance, the new vice president, said, well, of course that won't apply to people convicted of violent crimes. So even if he ran on this, it didn't really people didn't really understand the scope of what he was going to do. That's the first thing. Secondly, Trump was elected by two groups of people, by his MAGA, Make America Great Again faithful, who were fine with everything he was doing, but that would not have been sufficient to elect him president. Far from it. He was elected primarily by a combination of those people and people concerned about the economy. Relatively speaking, Trump hasn't done a heck of a lot about the economy so far. And, he's only been president 3 weeks, so that's understandable. But there's no sign whatever that he was elected, that these two groups of people agreed, except on two primary issues. One, the cost of living, and two, the number of immigrants in the United States. There is no number three that unites those two groups. And so he's on dangerous ground in terms of popularity. And I would point out that his popularity is still about 50-50. It's, 50% approve, 50% disapprove. And if he was wildly popular, that wouldn't be, a tie between those who approve and those who disapprove.
Greg, why is Congress not as involved as one would expect when you're shutting down government departments? We heard on that clip there from Donald Trump that Department of Education is going to be next. I mean, from what I understand, it's Congress that decides how money is spent by the US government, not the world's richest man. Yeah, I think Congress traditionally, in the last generation has underachieved, and they're not doing enough. I think more responsibility should be with Congress, not the and Trump's got a majority in Congress as well.
Yeah. I mean, the slim majority, that's one of the challenges. And so, look, I think that they are probably happy to see some of the administrative state reduced, and I think they need to do more in the future. They should take their own responsibility seriously. But look, traditional Republicans are coming around to this. Traditional Republicans, not the MAGA crowd, have always advocated smaller government, less bureaucracy, less regulation. So that's part of it. This has economic impact. Reducing the burden of the regulatory state on business and people is really good economically. It's good for the supply side. It's good for job creators. It's great for wage growth. So that will work. And then in terms of approvals, Harold's right. It's still a 50-50 country, but Joe Biden's polling at 36. I mean, this is really not a good time. So 50-50 isn't bad in terms of the way polling is lately. And then, of course, the transition and his first 3 weeks is polling very well. The specifically on reducing government, cutting costs, that's polling in the 60s.
Are you worried at all, Greg, when you get reports was in Reuters yesterday, President Trump's nominee as Air Force Secretary, currently a top official at the National Spy Satellite Agency, arranged for a multi-billion-dollar contract solicitation in a way that favored Elon Musk. So a lot of people have been saying, look, it's difficult when you have someone like Elon Musk involved so closely with government actions, when he is actually a huge beneficiary of that government spending. So there he is saying, well, there's a lot of waste in government, but of course he receives a lot of government money. Is that uncomfortable, perhaps?
It's always been uncomfortable. Like when you have government contractors like Dick Cheney come from, private sector in the defense sector into government, it's really hard to cut the cord. It doesn't surprise me that Elon Musk will have some overlap with defense and technology. That it's going to be difficult to ignore, but it's not like he's selling influence to foreign adversaries. He's on the right team. He's also too rich to bribe, which is refreshing. And that's one of the things we have to keep in mind about this threat to democracy argument. The press beat it to death, and the Democrats beat it to death. People started to believe it because they said it so often, not only during the election cycle, but during the midterm election cycle. But keep this in mind, it's all in the context of what's happened in the last 4 years. The Biden family influencing cartel, that news is not going away. I mean, we don't talk about it much, but anything that Elon Musk can do, and he's, again, too rich to bribe, compared to what the Biden family did, is apples and oranges completely. So I think we keep in mind in the context of the last 4 years, the real threat to democracy was the Democrats and the Biden administration. I have a long list. I won't bore you with it.
Harold, your view?
Somehow the Biden family cartel, I think, pales in comparison to what we're seeing and what we're going to see. Let me also put one thing in context. The federal government number of civilian employees, that is to say non-military, is 0.6% of the population, which has been slowly declining for many years, even though there are newer agencies. And half a century ago, it was well over 1%. So, are certain agencies slow and, just like certain private corporations are? Well, sure. But the slimming down, as it were, of government is really a political tool directed at agencies whose goals Donald Trump doesn't like USAID, like Department of Education. But you really, those are agencies established by Congress, not by the president. And you need Congress to act. And the Democrats would be happy to have a vote on this, but it's the Republicans who have been essentially caving to Donald Trump so long that the fact that their own power is being taken away from them is secondary to fear that if they go against Trump, the Republican base that elected them will go against them.
Harold, why do you think he's not going through Congress and the Senate, which enjoy a Republican majority? He seems to have put Elon Musk in charge. He's getting on with the job. He's bypassing Congress and the Senate. Why do you think he's chosen that way? Because perhaps he could bring more people on his side. I mean, a lot of people in every government agree that there is waste, and that waste needs to be looked at and got rid of wherever possible. Why do you think he's doing it this way?
Well, Trump's idea of government is not really particularly informed either by American history, of which he has a somewhat sketchy knowledge, or the law, the Constitution. It's a very personal form of interaction that he has, and it's driven, I think, by his sense of any relationship is a power relationship, and he likes to exert power even over long-time American allies like Canada. Pathetic countries whose power is not really comparable to ours, like poor little Denmark and Greenland. It's a personalized approach to government. I would point out that we're talking about the rush of initiatives that he's done since he's become president. Franklin Roosevelt sort of set the model when he came in at the very bottom of the Great Depression, creating the first 100 days. But the first 100 days was emergency legislation that he got through Congress, not so Donald Trump.
Greg, before we go, have you been surprised by the speed with which Donald Trump has got to work this time round? What do you think is different?
Yes, I'm totally surprised with the speed and the volume. I expected it to be exciting, but not this exciting. And so good for him. I'm so glad he's doing all these things. I want to comment on Harold's last comments. He's right on all of them. President Trump is a different president. It is personal, it is power, but he's doing what the people voted for. And this is one of the reasons he was elected. So I think, look, the Congress, this is going to be the hard work coming up. Congress has to extend the 2017 tax cuts. That's going to be really difficult with that slim majority. It's vulnerable. And so
does anybody dare stand up to Donald Trump from the Republicans?
Absolutely. And I've seen it in a few cases. But I think the party is very unified. But I do worry about the Congress because there's 5 or so kind of MAGA Republicans that will say no to any kind of spending, and then there's 5 or so moderates that are running in districts that Kamala won. They can't really go too crazy on spending because they're in blue states. So it's going to be challenging. And so I'm glad he hit the ground running with the executive actions. That's why people voted for him. But I think now the hard work begins. Congress has got a huge bill ahead of them.
Okay, Greg, thank you for coming in. Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas, political commentator, and also huge thank you to Harold Meyerson, editor-at-large of the American Prospect and former Washington Post journalist.